Now I would like to introduce the performer here, and she is Barbara Fankhauser, who earlier has delighted us with her presentations at our lecture series. She has been here maybe 4 or 5 times for Full House. Barbara is from Wisconsin, America's Siberia, and many Nordic people settled there and they froze to death. She is half Norwegian, and the other half she wants to keep a secret. Barbara earned a degree in English literature from San Francisco State College and came to live in Portland in 1981, where she, among other things, has been a communication director. She retired in 2007. Barbara's great love is storytelling, and she's the past president of Portland Storytellers Guild. And tonight, the title of Barbara's speech is Beauty Secrets of the Gods. So I will leave it to Barbara and become the audience.
Thank you, Åsa. Thank you for that great introduction, as always. And I also want to thank the Friday Night Lecture Series committee for inviting me back again. It's always a real joy to come and share some of my stories of the gods and goddesses of the Norse cosmology with you. Now, a lot of you have probably seen me already, but those of you who haven't, I'll just briefly tell you how I came to be telling these stories. Years ago, I saw some wonderful Native American speakers telling their stories, and it occurred to me that they have this rich culture of their stories, and I had never asked myself, what are my cultural stories? And as Åsa mentioned, my mother is all Norwegian, and my father, well, I'm not ashamed to say, he's Scotch-Irish to English. And when I looked at those two cultural heritages of mine, there was just a treasure trove of wonderful stories from Finn McCool and King Arthur, all the way to Odin and Freya and Loki and Thor and all the wonderful gods and goddesses of Norway, the Norse mythology. And so I started reading all about the different myths and all the stories about them, and found a lot of different variations and sort of started making sense of them. And it only occurred to me recently when I came across the story that I'm going to share with you momentarily, that in all the stories of all the gods and all the goddesses, never once do any of them ever age. They are always at the peak of perfection, if you will. They're beautiful, and they're powerful, and they're virile, and they're strong. They're no longer youthful, but they're not old. They're just at that moment of power. And it's true of all the Greek gods, the Hindu gods. They all seem to always be stuck right in that one perfect sweet spot. Until I came across this story, and I realized that, I don't know about the other cosmologies, but the Norse cosmology, they have a powerful beauty secret. And it's not a powder you mix in your smoothie in the morning, and it's not little oils you dab around your eyes or your chin to tighten things up. No, they had the golden apples of immortality. And the golden apples, these shining, beautiful golden apples, grew in a garden in the middle of Asgard, which is, of all the 9 worlds in the Norse mythology, this was where the gods lived. And there was a garden in the middle, and this tree with these beautiful golden apples on it. And it was tended by Idun, who was the wife of Bragi. He stayed in the house, and she was in the garden, and he was the resident poet and troubadour, and he'd be in his house writing poetry, and Idun would be out in the garden tending all the flowers and everything, but particularly the tree of the golden apples of immortality. And each morning she would go out, she had a little ashwood box she would take out, and she would pluck these golden apples off the tree and fill this box with them. And then any god or goddess that lived in Asgard who was beginning to feel a little, maybe a little creaky in the hip, or they might notice a little line coming around their eye, or maybe some of the beautiful golden hair beginning to look a little grayish, they would make an effort, they would purposely come actually to Idun's garden. And Idun would reach into the box and hand them one of these golden apples, and they would eat it, and all would be restored. And so life was perfect. Now, I pointed this out that Idun plucked the apples, and Idun handed them to the god or goddess from the box. And this was important because if anybody had wandered into the garden and tried to pluck one of those apples off the tree without bothering to go through Idun, it would rot in their hand. And if they were to reach into her wooden box and take an apple, it would also rot in their hand. So there was a link there with Idun and the apples, that they could only be picked by Idun and they could only be handed out by Idun. Now, Odin was the father god of all 9 worlds of this great mythology. And he was a pretty intense, hands-on kind of god. I mean, he had his 2 ravens, Hunin and Munin, who sat on his shoulders, and each morning, 2 ravens would fly out across the 9 worlds. And each evening, they would fly back, and one would land on one shoulder and tell him all that he had seen, and the other would land on his shoulder and tell him everything that it meant. Now, he also had a high tower that he would climb up, and he could look out across all 9 worlds and see what was going on everywhere. But he was also, as I said, a real hands-on god, and he liked to go out into the lands. He would leave Asgard and go to Midgard, where the humans lived, and he would go to Jotunheim, where the ice giants lived. And wherever he wanted. Sometimes he'd go as a traveler, wrapped in a cloak and a broad-brimmed hat, and sometimes he would go just as Odin. Now, the trip that he decided to take one day, he invited Honir, and one of the ancient gods, and Loki to accompany him, and he was going as Odin himself. Well, you might wonder why he would invite Loki, and I'll tell you, Loki, for all the mischief that Loki could create, Loki also had a repertoire of stories and songs, and many of his stories were quite bawdy, and he made traveling a joy. And so he was a wonderful traveling companion, and the 3 of these gods went out of Asgard, over the Rainbow Bridge, and out into the northern part of the worlds, Jotunheim. This was a trip that Odin wanted to take and see what was going on in that part of the world. Well, the 3 of them had walked quite a ways through stark, barren countryside. I mean, it was the further north they went, the more barren it became. Normally when they went on these junkets, they would find berries and nuts to eat along the way, and there was always game to catch, so they would have a good meal each night. But this particular day, they had walked and walked for hours and not found one single thing to eat, nothing to forage, and they had not seen any game at all. And they were getting hungry. And when Loki was a god of appetites, and when he got hungry, he got kind of annoying and whiny. And so they were walking along, and Loki was being kind of obnoxious, and they heard something that sounded like oxen, and they crested a hill, and they looked, and there was a green valley in front of them. A beautiful, lush, green, grassy valley with a herd of wild oxen in it. Well, dinner was ready for them. So Odin said he and Honir would go and slay one of the oxen, and Loki should gather firewood, build a fire pit, and prepare so they could cook this wonderful supper they were going to have. So Odin and Honir did that, and Loki gathered up a bunch of firewood he found, and he dug a big pit, and he put the fire, and he got the fire going, and it was, nicely, the coals were glowing, and the flames were flicking, and Odin and Honir came back. They had dressed out this oxen. They had 2 big haunches and 2 big shoulders, and it was a rich, meaty thing. They laid the meat in on the coals and covered them up, and they sat back and were waiting to have this wonderful supper. And they waited. Now, the thing is, if you've probably put meat on a grill at some point in your life, and when the meat begins to cook and that aroma of cooking meat hits you, and you salivate, you're ready for this meal, and that never happened. they sat and they waited, and they never got this smell of this good meat cooking. And finally, after a long enough time that the meat should certainly have been cooked, they pulled all the branches and things back, and they looked at it, and the meat in the fire pit was as cold and raw as when they had put it in. Well, Odin said, Loki, what kind of fire did you build? This is inexcusable. So Loki knew that he had done a good fire, and so he was furious. He put more logs in, though, more scraps of wood, and he blew on it, and he got the flames going again, and they put the meat back in, and they covered it up again, and they waited. And they waited twice as long this time. And still that aroma never came. And when they pulled the branches and everything back to look at the meat, it was still as cold and raw as when they had put it in. Well, now Odin began to think that perhaps there was something else going on here than Loki's inability to make a good fire. And they suddenly heard this laughter coming from behind them. They looked up, and there in a snag, a tall snag, there was the biggest eagle you'd ever seen. Oh, it was a huge eagle. And it was laughing at them. So, Lord Loki, you seem to be having some trouble with your fire. You can't seem to cook your meat. Well, Loki said, you're right, I can't. Perhaps you could help. Whoa, said the eagle, you could eat it raw like eagles do. Or perhaps, if you care to share it, I might be able to help you cook it. Well, Loki thought how much can an eagle eat? It's a whole oxen. There's 3 of us and 1 eagle. Certainly that would be more than adequate. And so he said, if you can help me cook this oxen, I would be happy to share it with you. And so this eagle swooped down. Oh, he was huge. He landed in front of the fire pit, and he began to wave his wings back and forth until he created like a billows effect, and the flames shot up. And now the smell of that cooking meat came to them. Their mouths began to salivate, anticipating the taste of this meat. And then they pulled it back, and the eagle stepped forward and took 2 of the haunches on his shoulder for himself. And Loki watched him, this eagle taking way more than his share. He was furious. He grabbed a stick that was there on the ground, and he swung it at the eagle as hard as he could, and that stick smashed against the eagle's chest. The eagle looked at him, and the eagle began to move his wings and rise up off the ground, and that is when Loki realized that his hands were stuck to the other end of the stick, and he could not let go. Well, the eagle rose up into the air, not too high. He began to fly across this barren land just low enough that he could drag Loki's shins and knees and feet across every briar bush and scraggy rock in the area. He was dragging him along across this land, and Loki was screaming for him to let go, put me down, put me down. It was the blood was running down his shins at this point, and the eagle just kept on going across the land. And then he left the shore and went out across this cold North Sea and kept flying. And Loki hung from this stick from the eagle across the water until he came to a rocky outcropping in the middle of the sea, and the waves were splashing up. And there the eagle landed and let go of Loki finally. Well, Loki fell to this rock, and he was clinging to it, and the eagle perched up high on a ledge up there, and he looked down and he said, so, Lord Loki, I finally have you where I've wanted one of you from Asgard all along. Ever since you cheated my brother making the wall around Asgard. That is another story, but grudges go from story to story. So, now, you can stay here, or you can bring me something that I want. Well, Loki said, what is it you want? What do you want that will get me off this rock? And the eagle said, you can bring me Idun and her golden apples. Loki was, that's an impossible request. Idun never leaves the garden. Nobody's ever gotten her out of that garden. How am I supposed to do that? And the eagle simply said, that is for you to decide. I will come back in a day and see if perhaps you've come up with a plan. And if not, then you will be here for a very long time. With that, the eagle leapt off the rock and flew back across the sea to the land. Well, Loki, with his cuts and bruises, that salt water washing up on the rock all night long, you know what salt in a wound does. And the cold and the waves and the loneliness. And finally, the next day, through the dim light, he saw the eagle returning. And the eagle landed on the rock. It said, "So, Lord Loki, have you had some time to think about how you might fulfill my request?" Loki said, who are you?" And the eagle said, "I am Thiassi, the frost giant that lives here. So tell me, are you going to deliver what I want?" Well, Loki said, I have had thoughts all night long how I might meet what you wish, and I think I have a way that I could get Idun out of her garden. And so Thiassi, the eagle, said, "Then fine, you will meet me in 10 days. And he told Loki where to meet him. And he said, "And if you are not there with Idun and her apples, I will find you, and it will not go well for you." Well, Loki knew that to be the case, and he agreed. And so the eagle grabbed Loki by the shoulders and his talons and flew him back across the water and dropped him on the shore. It was a long, long walk back to Asgard from where Loki had been dropped, and he had a lot of time to think about how he was going to manage to get Idun and her apples out of Asgard. And when he got back to Asgard, well, Odin and Hunner had already gotten back there and told everyone about Loki's misadventures trying to cook this meat and this eagle and hitting the eagle, and everybody found it all very funny, and they all laughed a lot, which only deepened Loki's rage at the gods. So he waited and he watched Idun in the garden, and on the appointed day that he needed to deliver her to Thiassi, the frost giant, he went to the garden and kind of hung around in the background, and he watched as Idun plucked the apples and put them in the box, and watched as different gods or goddesses wandered into the garden and received their apple from Idun, until finally Idun was alone with her apples, the box, and he stepped out from behind some shrubs and said, "Oh, Idun, how are you?" Well, Idun, she was such a sweet thing. She was just the kindest. She barely passed girlhood, it seemed. She was just so young and sweet, and she greeted Master Loki and said, I did not see you here. What, did you want an apple?" And Loki said, "Well, I would like to look at your apples. Could I look at one?" And she handed it to him, and he looked at it and turned and said, "Well, I'm just trying to decide if it's as big as the ones I saw yesterday." "What do you mean?" she said. "Well, I saw a tree with apples just like this, but I think the apples on the tree that I saw were actually tinier. And they were very sweet. I'm not sure, they may have even been sweeter than your apples." There is not another tree in the world, 9 worlds like my tree. You couldn't have seen a tree like this. And Loki said, "Well, I thought that was the case until I saw this tree yesterday, and I really do think that the tree that I saw the apples were bigger and shinier." "Well, I have to see this tree." He said, well, I could take you to it." Well, yes, you must take me to I have to see this tree." And he said, "Well, okay, well, why don't you bring your box of apples so you can compare your apples to the apples on this tree?" Well, certainly she picked up her apples, and she was horrified at the thought there might be another tree like hers in the world. And she followed Loki out of the garden, through Asgard, past Heimdall, the guardian of the Rainbow Bridge, over the Rainbow Bridge, and down to the base, where Loki said, "Okay, you know that path up there through the grove, and there's a knoll up there. The tree is growing on top of that knoll right up there. I'll join you in a moment. I have a rock in my shoe. As soon as I get it out, I'll catch up with you. Go on up ahead." So Idun took her box of apples and she marched up this trail to see this tree that could not possibly exist, except she had to see if that was true. And she walked up and she came into a knoll, and she looked around. It was kind of a bare knoll. There was not an apple tree in sight, and she was wondering what game Loki was playing, when suddenly she heard a whirring of wings behind her, and talons grabbed her and her box of apples and lifted up into the air and flew off north to Jotunheim, the land of the ice giants. Well, the eagle flew a long way, and when he got to his fortress, it was a huge rocky outcropping with fissures in the surfaces that he could fly in, and when he came in, it was a great cavern inside, and he slowly circled down until he reached the ground, and he dropped Idun on a shelf there towards the bottom. Well, she looked around. It was a huge cold cavern. Here and there would be a flame of fire would shoot up out of a crack in the floor over here and over there, and it was dark and scary, and there was this eagle standing there until he took his robes off, and there stood Thiassi, the frost giant. "Now, Idun, you will give me your apples." She said, "I will not. These are only for the gods. I will never give you my apples." And he said, "Well, then I will take one." And he pulled her box away from her and took an apple, and it rotted in his hands in a moment. You can't take my apples. I'm the only one who can give the apples away, and I will never give you an apple. Well, then, he said, "You will be here for a very long time until you decide that you will give me an apple. But even if you don't, it doesn't matter, because you can sit here and think about the gods not getting their apples and what their fates will be soon enough." Idun thought about that and was horrified. How was she going to be able to take care of the gods and keep them powerful and young without the apples? Well, she sat down on that ledge, and Thiassi left her there alone to think about what she was going to do. Meanwhile, back in Asgard, a day went by, and some of the gods and goddesses came to the garden to get their golden apple, and, well, Idun was not there. Well, they knocked on the door, and Bragi was not there either. Now, Bragi, sometimes he went off on troubadour trips and reciting poetry and singing songs out across the 9 worlds, and they thought, well, perhaps Idun has gone with him on one of his trips, so we'll come back tomorrow and see if she's back. And so the next day they came back, and still there was no Idun. And the next day and the next day. And meanwhile, gradually, some of them began to feel a little stiff in the hip, and some of their hair began to kind of, well, Sif's beautiful golden hair actually looked like it was tarnishing. And some of their muscles began to not be quite as firm as they were. And Thor was sure that his hammer was getting a little heavier, but that wasn't possible. Each of the gods and goddesses began to notice wrinkles around their eyes, and they were aging. And Odin saw this as well. And it began to be more and more of a concern as some of the gods even kind of began to get a little fuddled in their head, and forgetful, and they couldn't find things. They'd lose things regularly, or a friend would come along and have to find things for them, or they couldn't remember how to get home, and so someone would take them home. And Odin knew that this was not going to get better until Idun returned with her golden apples, and so he called for a meeting in the Great Hall that all the residents of Asgard needed to come to the Great Hall, and then they needed to kind of ascertain what might have happened to Idun. So it took a little while because, well, some people weren't moving very fast anymore, and they all kind of managed to get to the Great Hall, and Odin was there, and he was leaning on his staff at this point, and he looked out at all the gods and goddesses and said, we need to determine what might have happened to Idun. So who here can remember the last time they saw Idun? Oh, everybody kind of thought about it for a while, and finally Heimdall raised his hand. He said, you know, I think I might have been the last one to see her. I saw her leave Asgard with Loki. Loki. Of course, Loki. Where is Loki? It was determined he was not there. He was the only god that was not present in the hall. So Odin said, go and find Loki and bring him back. Well, those who were able to move fastest went out, and they searched all of Asgard, and they finally found him hiding actually in a manure pile behind one of the barns. And they brought him before Odin. And Odin said, Loki, we need to know what you have done with Idun. Why do you think I have done anything with Idun? Because you were seen leaving Asgard with her. I have no idea where Idun might be. I have no idea. Well, Odin said, we shall start heating some blades up for some torture, if that's what we need to do, if that's where you're going to take it, Loki. Well, perhaps I might have an idea where she is. I could find her if we put away the idea of talking about torture. Okay, so Odin said, you will bring her back, or we will kill you. So Loki knew that Odin was not going to settle for any shenanigans from him. He said, all right, but I need Freya's falcon cloak. Well, Freya was leaning on a cane over there. Her hair had gone gray and her face was wrinkled, and she looked at Loki and said, you need my falcon cape. Why? He said, if you want me to go and bring Idun back, I need your falcon cape. You bring it back intact. And then she sent someone to go and get the cape. And when it arrived, Loki took it and he put her cape on and became a falcon. He shot out over the walls of Asgard and flew north, where he knew Thiassi's fortress was. He flew for a long time, and when he finally saw this great rocky fortress there on the shoreline, he circled around and landed in a tree to observe what he could see. He saw Thiassi in a boat out on the sea heading out to fish. And down below he saw his daughter Skadi working with the garden, something. He flew down closer. He knew Skadi was a falconer. She fancied herself quite a birder. She would catch these beautiful raptors and teach them to hunt. She took a lot of pride in that. And so Loki came a little closer and a little closer, and when she spotted this beautiful falcon on a branch not far away, she tried to coax him down with some raw meat, and the falcon, Loki, was happy to oblige, landed on her glove. She gave him some raw meat, and he was beautiful. She wanted to put some jesses on his legs and show him to her father. So she carried him into the great hall where she and her father Thiassi lived, and that was exactly what Loki was hoping for, because once inside he saw Idun sitting in the distance on a rocky ledge with her apples, looking so forlorn. Well, he teased Skadi for a little while, and then finally he took off up out of one of the cracks in the fissure up high in the fortress. Well, Skadi ran out and tried to catch him, but she saw him circling and disappear, gave up on training that bird, catching that bird. She went on about her business, and Loki, meanwhile, circled back, came back in through that fissure when Skadi wasn't around, flew down and landed on the ledge next to Idun. Idun looked over at this falcon and realized it looked like the falcon of Freya's cape. And suddenly, Loki turned back into himself. Loki, she said, Lord Loki, you are the one that has caused me all this misery. And Loki said, yes, and I'm the one that can get you out. Now you need to trust me and do what I tell you, and I will return you to Asgard. Well, she had a hard time because it was him that had gotten her there. And so, but what choice did she have? And so she said, all right. So Loki recited some runes and turned her into a hazelnut. And as a hazelnut, he could pick her up in his talons, fly back up out of the fissure, and began to wing his way south towards Asgard. Well, he was flying along, and he had Idun in his talons. And about then, Thiassi returned to shore and came in to, he was going to come in and see if he could convince Idun to give him some of the apples. But when he got there, she was gone. He stormed out, saw Skadi, asked where had Idun gone, and Skadi said, I don't know, but there is that falcon that was here earlier. And when Thiassi looked, he knew who the falcon was. He immediately went in and he put his eagle cape on, turned into an eagle, and shot up into the sky after that falcon. Well, he was bigger and he was more powerful, and even though Loki had a head start, Thiassi was coming on hard behind him. Now, before Loki had left Asgard, he had given Odin instructions that everybody in town needed to find wood shavings, and cover the top of the Asgard's walls with the wood shavings. And that when he got there to fly through, they were to ignite the shavings into flames. So he was flying hard. The people from Asgard could see now the little speck of a falcon coming, and behind him, the bigger eagle gaining on him, and they were flying hard, and Loki was getting closer and closer, and finally he shot over the wall of Asgard, and they threw the torches down and ignited the wood shavings, and the flames shot up, and Thiassi was coming hard and close enough that he could not pull back and he could not turn, and he flew into the flames, and his feathers caught on fire, and he crashed to the ground, dead. Well, everyone was so happy to see Loki back and have Idun and the golden apples back. But at the same time, Odin was saddened because he had made a vow that there would be no lives taken within the walls of Asgard, and here was the body of Thiassi. Well, they built a pyre for him. He was, in Odin's mind, a worthy opponent. He had always been an excellent warrior and someone worthy of fighting. And so they built a pyre for him. And in the meantime, they also created a celebration to welcome Idun home and have her apples. And well, everybody had their apple right away, of course, and their youth came back, the pains went away, the eyesight came back, the hair was once again beautiful and golden, the muscle tone was fabulous, and the one thing they did learn was what it might feel like to be a mere mortal. But they had a celebration. They wanted to celebrate Idun's return. And they were dancing and singing and feasting. But meanwhile, back in Jotunheim, Skadi had waited for her father's return. And when she finally realized he was not coming back, she knew that he had met an untimely death at the hands of the gods of Asgard, and she would have her revenge. She would have a life for a life. And so she put on her battle armor and her helmet, and she took her spear and her sword, and she set off for Asgard. And she arrived as this great celebration was going on. They looked and they saw her coming through the gates of Asgard, this warrior, this fierce-looking warrior, and Odin rose and came to meet her and greeted her. You are welcome to join our celebration, but we are not having wars. We will not have conflict within the walls of Asgard. she took off her helmet then, and they saw that it was Skadi, Thiassi's daughter, and she said, "You have killed my father. How do you say that you will not have death within the walls of Asgard? You have taken my father, and I will have a life for his life." Well, Odin said, we will not give you a life, but we will give you another boon. Tell me what you would take in place of your father. Well, Skadi was standing there looking around at all the gods and goddesses standing there in a circle around her. And her eyes landed on Balder. Balder was Odin's youngest son. And Balder was the fairest of all the gods. He was beautiful. And he was kind, and he was sweet-tempered, and everyone loved Balder. And they could see her interest. And so she said, "I would like 3 things. I will take 3 things in return for my father's death. First, I would pick a husband from the gods. Second, you must make me laugh, for I have not laughed since my father died. And third, you will tell me how you would honor my father's death." Well, Odin said, "Let us have a council, and we will come back to see, to discuss your request." So he called all the gods, and they went into the hall, and everybody knew that what she wanted was Balder, and nobody wanted to give Balder to the daughter of an ice giant. And so they said, they talked among themselves, and finally they came up with a plan, and they came back out to Skadi, and they said, "Okay, you are welcome to pick a god for a husband. Any one of the men of the gods of Asgard will be your choice. But you can only pick them by their feet." She says, "By their feet?" She says, "Yes, we will blindfold you. You will be able to look down. You can see their feet, but that's how you have to pick your husband." Well, she thought to herself, Balder is so beautiful. He will have the most beautiful feet of all. Should not be a problem. So she agreed. She would pick her husband by looking at their feet. So they blindfolded Skadi, and she could see just, down to the ground a little bit. And then all the gods lined up. She walked along looking at each set of feet. Whoa, look, that guy has black toenails, and who knew toes could be that hairy? Oh, and look at the crooked toes on that guy. And there were just so many really ugly toes and feet. Until she came to the pair of beautifully shaped, creamy white feet. The toenails were clean and lovely, and the shape was lovely. This feet this perfect could only belong to Balder. And so she said, I pick this god for my husband. And they took her blindfold off, and instead of looking at Balder, she was looking into the eyes of Njorn, god of the sea. Well, she tried not to be disappointed. She almost said something that would not have set off their marriage well to begin with, and Njorn stopped her and said, "The first words between us will set our marriage course, so be careful." And so Skadi held her place, and she said, "Well, but you have not made me laugh yet. You have to make me laugh." So, meanwhile, Thor had taken Loki out and said, "Loki, you're the cause of this. You're the one that needs to figure out how to make her laugh." So Loki went off to the barn while they were all kind of sitting around waiting, and he came back in a little while with a billy goat. He had the billy goat tied around a rope tied around the billy goat's whiskers, and he was pulling the billy goat into this arena where they were sitting. And he said, I was trying to take my goat to the market, and I had my hands full, and I didn't know what else to do with him, so I had to tie him there, and then I had to tie him to someplace on me, and so I tied him here." And he took the rope and he tied it around his male parts. And he began to have a tug of war with the goat. Well, he would pull the goat, and the goat would bleed and bleed and bleed as he was pulling the goat's chin whiskers. And then the goat would pull back, and Loki would bleed and bleed and bleed. And so they went back and forth and back and forth. And Scotty was watching this, and a little tiny smile began to appear at one corner of her lips. And they kept pulling. And finally, the goat gave up and rushed towards Loki. And Loki, who'd been pulling with all his might, flipped up in the air and came down upside down in Scotty's lap with all his manhood on display. At which point, Scotty began to laugh. She laughed and she laughed, and tears came down her cheeks. She was laughing so hard. And finally, Loki crawled out of her lap and rearranged his tunic. And so the second request had been met by the citizens of Asgard. And then Odin said, "Come with me, Scotty." And he took her out to where this pyre that they had built for her father. And he lay on the pyre, and next to it were two large orbs. And he picked them up and said, "These are your father's eyes. I will honor your father by putting them into the heavens." And Odin took them and he threw them up. And they landed in the heavens, shining down on Scotty and all the citizens of Asgard and the Nine Worlds. And to this day, Thiassi's eyes watch down from the heavens. So all three conditions had been met, and Scotty and Njorn had a big wedding. It was a wonderful wedding, and everybody danced. And finally, at the end of the wedding, Scotty and Njorn had to decide where they were going to live. Well, Njorn lived in a house by the sea because he was the sea god, and Scotty lived in this fortress up in the frozen Northland. And so they said, "Okay, well, why don't we go live at your place for 9 days, and then we'll go and live at my place for 9 days." So they started off first going to Scotty's house up in Jotunheim. And they got there, and the first night, Njorn could not sleep with the howling of the wind and the howling of the wolves, and it was foreign to him. But you know, those were the sounds that were Scotty's cradle song. She just slept like a baby. Oh, she loved those sounds. Well, 9 days went on, and poor Njorn, he did not get a good night's sleep the whole time. And finally, it was 9 days were up, and they were going to go to his place at the shore, and he could finally get a good night's sleep. And they went down there, and there, Scotty listened to the screeching of the seagulls and the slapping of tack against masts and boats banging into each other, and the smell of fish. And she could not get a good night's sleep there. For 9 nights, she could not get a good night's sleep there. And finally, at the end of it, it was like, this is not working out. I can't live where you live, and you can't live where I live. And why don't we just go to our own houses and live our own lives? And so Scotty went back to Jotunheim, to that fortress that she and her father had shared. And Njorn stayed by the sea. And Scotty, she became a snow goddess. She had skis that she could travel through the mountains on. And the wolves were her companions. And at night, she would sit by the fire and think about Balder and think, what if? What if? And that is the story of Scotty. Thank you very much. I think we're going to have some questions now. So,
yes, now for a few questions. Thank you so much. I was actually feeling sorry for Loki for a while. Well, you are an amazing storyteller, and thank you so much. But it made me think about the fact that that's a unique skill set. So our first question is, if somebody's starting out trying to tell better stories, what would one thing what would your advice be for them? One thing.
One thing. Well, I was the president of the Portland Storytellers Guild for a long time, and I will tell you that every month from September to May, they have a story swap. And it's a place where you can, I mean, we're doing it virtually now, but when this is over, it'll go back to being in person. And it's a gathering of people who are interested in learning how to tell stories. And it's a really safe place, and you can listen to stories, and you can try out a story, and it's where I go there sometimes when I'm working on a story and I want to just run it through in front of an audience. So there's every level of storytelling, and the Guild is a terrific place if you want to get your toe in the water and start trying out stories and have a lot of support.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
You obviously have a passion for folk tales and myths. Have you always been engaged by them, or what really was the nugget that drew you on this path?
Well, my earliest memories as a tiny girl were my dad coming in and sitting on my bed each night and telling me stories. So I fell in love with stories when I was probably 3 or 4 years old, and have loved stories ever since. When I grew up, I went into advertising, which is another form of storytelling. Right. And then in the late 80s, I read about a storyteller coming through town. He was British, and telling stories at 7 o'clock at night, which is not really a time where you would think of children's stories. So I went to it, and here was this man making his way around the world telling stories for a living. And I just was enchanted with the stories that he was telling, and that people did this. Grown-ups did it for grown-ups. And so I found the Guild and started telling stories, and then found my way to the stories that really touched me, and that's how I wound up being a storyteller.
Do you think that Nordic myths or folk tales have something unique that sets them apart, or are there key commonalities across the world in mythology?
I think the myths are really powerful. I think they're 1,000 years old, and there's a reason why they're still here, because they talk to things that are, I think Jung and Freud talked a lot about the inner workings of the mind, and I think the archetypes, and those exist in the myths today, and I think there's so much still there for us to take away. And the same with folk tales and fairy tales. They've been around for hundreds of years, sometimes thousands of years. And what is it about a story that stays that long and that rich? I think the stories we see in modern life are the things on television, and I doubt very much if CSI is going to be around in 1,000 years. But I think the Norse myths will still be here. Mm-hmm. So yeah.
So are there any myths or stories that are contemporary that you think might be lasting?
Contemporary. I don't know what contemporary folk tales are. I think there are new versions of old tales, but
So they sort of draw back from old themes.
Yeah.
If you were to suggest the best book on myths for children and for storytelling for children, what would you suggest?
There's a whole bunch of wonderful books out there, but I don't generally tell stories to children. I really stay with the adults, and I could tell you some books that I use for my myths. I have 3 or 4 different ones I go to that have the same stories, but all little slight variations on them that I use. There are children's books with the myths in them that are been written for children's reading levels, and they're in the library. And I would recommend any librarian could help you find a bunch of them.
Yeah, those librarians are good.
Yeah, I love the librarians.
If we wanted a more serious and in-depth study of Nordic mythology, where would you suggest we go other than the librarian Is there any favorite source for your stories?
You know, there's a couple of really good books that I have in my library. One is called The Vikings, I think. The Norse myths. I can't tell you the authors' names. I could send them to you if people would like to know them. Neil Gaiman has come out in the last couple of years with a version of his Norse myths through his lens, and that's a really nice book. But yeah, I have 3 or 4 different ones with the same stories, like I say, but all from different. And some of the books even go into a lot of the meaning behind the myths and what the gods and goddesses represent. So there's a lot of really good books out there on the Norse myths.
So out of all these myths and stories that you've told, is there one of the characters that speaks to you more than another?
You know, I really love Odin. And one of the first stories I ever told when I came here was a story I'd woven together of Odin and the first Norwegian immigrants that left Norway to go to America. And I wove that together, and what I saw as I was working with the myth and the immigration stories, Odin knew that there was going to be a terrible thing coming to the gods of Asgard, and he went to find wisdom to figure out how to deal with it. And he had to give his right eye to get this knowledge, and he did. And I think about the immigrants leaving Norway, leaving everything they love and everyone they know behind to give their children a better future. And I just saw that cross between what Odin was willing to sacrifice and what they were willing to sacrifice. And it just, that's why I love Odin, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. Do you have a favorite American myth or folk tale that sort of is reminiscent of Nordic themes at all?
I'm not sure how to answer that. There are so many stories that I love, and I can't really take that right back to Norwegian. I do love the troll who didn't keep his heart in his body. That's a favorite story that I've told a number of times, and I like that a lot. And in fact, that whole book that story is in is full of wonderful stories. But I don't know how to answer that question beyond that.
When you're putting a story together to tell it, what kind of research do? You said early on that, you found so many different stories and they each differ just a little bit. How do you put that all together?
Well, I read them all, and maybe a couple times. And then I go on walks, and while I'm walking, I'm thinking about the versions. I'm thinking about the trajectory of the story and getting that down and beginning to put it into my own words. And so I do it all in my head. I don't try to write anything down until I've gotten the story going in my head. Because written language, a written story has a whole different feel than a told story. And I want it in verbal, not written language. Mm-hmm. And once I get the story and it'll be just a composite of all these different sources that I've already read and studied, and then it becomes my story. And once I've got that, then I will actually sit down probably and tell the story to myself as I type it into my computer, just so I have it as a record for down the road. If I haven't told the story for a while, I can go back to it. But that's my method. Other storytellers have other methods.
Great. I think that's really all the questions, except for this one from my neighbor's children, actually. Okay. So they want to know, the Nissa stories are very common at Christmas. Nissa, Tomten, the elves, the small people.
Right.
What do they do the rest of the year?
They work in the mines, I think.
Or the barn, maybe.
Or the barn.
Is there a question I haven't asked that you'd like to, or a thought that you'd like to share with all of us?
And no, I'm so glad to see people that want to hear the oral stories and are interested in keeping the tradition alive and listening, or whether they want to tell or just listen. It's just, I think it's a really wonderful art form. And the only one, like acting, there's the fourth wall, but with storytellers, you're eye to eye with your audience. And what's interesting is the story exists in the space between. Because what I tell you and what I see when I'm telling you, you have your own vision of what that story is looking like. Right. And that's that space in between us that where everything is alive.
Well, thank you. We'll let Åsa close us up for the evening.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much, Barbara. You were always fantastic. As I said before, Barbara has been here maybe 3 or 4 times before, and she is always good. And I beginning to believe in those gods. Because you made them think that they're so believable. The whole story is believable. I have to tell you that they were so strong in Scandinavia that when Christianity was introduced to Europe, they didn't believe in God. They didn't believe in Jesus, because how a little guy with sandals and with a little scarf around, how could he compare with Odin and Loki and all those wonderful gods? So it was really, really very difficult for the missionaries to introduce Christianity to Scandinavia, because we had those powerful gods. And you made them even more powerful. And thank you so much for coming and getting it together.
Thank you for having me.
So we have also something for March, and that is, it's going to be finished this time. This is, hold on. It is March 5th, and it's the person is called, what's this called? Carl Malanders, and he's going to talk about the Kalevala. And he waves it, wove it into his book, Deep River. And he finds something in Deep River that was in the Kalevala. And he is an excellent speaker, I have been told. And he is also a Rhodes Scholar. He lives down on the coast. And if you don't know what the Kalevala is, you ought to look it up, because it's the Finnish national epic, and the Finns are very proud of that one. So that is for March 5th. And then we have April, we have Dr. Scott Burns plus another geologist from PSU. They're going to talk about climate change in the Nordic countries, and that's a very timely topic. So that's going to be in April 9th. We are not going to have April 2nd, because that's Good Friday, and that might not work for the people who go to church or whatever they do. So, and then we have the last lecture of Growing Up in Iceland is in May, and that is Growing Up in Iceland. We tried to get all these lectures with Growing Up in Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and so forth lined up. Because of the COVID, we couldn't do it. We had to cancel and do all those things. So she comes in last, Iceland, but she's a real Icelander. And she will talk about how it is to grow up in Iceland. And that will be the last lecture of our season, if we don't decide to have something in June, which I don't think we will. And then we will start again in October and November. And I hope actually that we will meet again, maybe in April or May. We could maybe have half and half, we might have visual, or we might have something like that. But the vaccination has begun, and it's a possibility. So, until next, I also want to thank the staff. The people who put this together here is great. We would be dust without them. We wouldn't have anything. They put over the microphones and the cameras and the computers and set up the room. And thank you so much, Whitman and Erik, for doing that. This is really great. We couldn't live without you. So we will see you the March 5th, and be good so long. Bye-bye.